I have to recognize that the first two speakers have exercised first movers advantage. So I'm going to now, in the interest of time, look, no, not at all. I fully understand. No, ma'am, and then Veslin, and then Rohini. Do not repeat anything that's already been said. So that need not be done. But if I can just request you to be precise, only in the interest of time, so that we can also encourage students to ask you questions. I hope you guys have questions, right? So, okay. So then, ma'am, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I think in any case, your instruction is well noted. I don't think it will be possible for other panelists to repeat what has been stated already. For one, I would really compliment first Ambassador Dileep Sinha for giving us the sound historical, the origins, I think, of this whole debate on Security Council. And of course, then we have his book that I also recommend to the students to go through. And to Professor Murthy, I would say one thing. We don't need a white paper, sir, to prepare. I think if we just have you to canvas for us on the permanent membership, I think you will be far more effective. You have carried, I could see from the faces of the students, the panelists, and the eminent members of the faculty that you have made a case. Well, at last, the level at which I come in, but just one thing, even if it's going to cut into my quota of time, this was very interesting to learn about Australia. Perhaps Dileep would have known, and it's in his book. But there was, yet another lost opportunity when the Americans probed Mrs. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was then our ambassador, on the possibility of giving us the seat in place of China. No, but it was not non-serious. I'm afraid that's a subject for another panel discussion, of course. But we were at that time just so convinced and so suspicious of the US plans and designs that we thought they were doing it to drive a wedge between us and our friendly communist neighbor that we did not. In fact, Mrs. Pandit just stopped Dulles, I think. She didn't even let him complete the argument, what the case he was making, and already sent it off to Pandit Nehru with a negative recommendation. So, well, anyway, that's another thing, but you know it, and perhaps the students might just learn of it. There is perhaps a logic to it, as he said. Maybe we were meant to do this tapasya for 25 years already, and I don't know how many more later. Now, that takes about 2-3 minutes of my time. I just come in, I'm afraid, just a little sobering reminder. UN is much more, of course, Security Council is the apex, and that is really where the power center is. And we've just seen the kind of contradictions, the kind of double standards, and there's no recourse if you don't agree with it. Even if you go to the highest court, I think you go back to the council and you can be just vetoed. And we've seen the Permanent Five, how they vetoed, resolutions which were against their friends, allies, and coalition and bloc partners. But I think we must not lose sight, even as this campaign, and I can assure you, Professor Murthy, there is no intention by the government of India, I think, to pull out of this campaign. But yes, work must go on, business must go on, I think, in all other fields. And it would be a misperception to think that that is all, that if you're not into the power club, of course, I mean, it has its own story and its narrative. There is a lot more to the UN, and there's a lot more to the reform. And UN, as the previous panel, in fact, had a nice kind of a quiz on evaluating its success and failures. There were interesting areas which came up. It has a mixed picture. It has a mixed record. It's a lot which it has achieved, and a lot which has disappointed, and a lot which was not possible, I think. So hence, I mean, without now my enumerating any of those issues, I think, the fact is that there is, yes, it's a huge organization, extremely ambitious mandate. And it has not just a body in New York, but it has specialized agencies, 15 specialized agencies, and this they've increased. They have 6 funds and programs, and bodies which are also defunct still continue to exist. And these agencies and funds are actually doing very substantive, distinct work. Now what has happened is that in this whole flavor and interest in reform, reform somehow has become, we think of the Security Council reform, but the reform that the Group 1 countries have been thinking about is rationalizing the UN, restructuring the UN, downsizing the UN, and taking away the programs which were in fact in the interest of the developing countries. So if you see, that is why I feel these are the two things to watch out for. But this is the power realities. But you have to be cognizant of them and you have to guard against that. So it is altogether, it is in the interest of a country like India to engage very actively with all bodies of the United Nations, all its programs, but also know what we want to get out of some of the programs. And remember now, because of these years of the anti-UN rhetoric of the developed countries who have been reducing the money flows, the regular budget flows, their program priorities are not exactly what our program priorities are. But the reality is things like programs like development projects, capacity building, technical assistance, these have now, they're no longer practical realities. They are more or less a thing of the past, except with certain agencies like the Intellectual Property Organization or the Health or UNICEF, which is able, which are well flushed with funds, because some of these agencies are also earning their own revenues. So I would just, because at the end of the day, and we have limited time, just highlight, we all know what the issues are, the challenges are, and of course the reform is, we were just told, started from the moment of the inception of the organization. I want to just share one anecdote and then go on to what I see as two principal trends that we ought to be watching out for, which will just give you an idea. Because when we think of UN, we say reform. Why should this panel be all about reform? What is the UN supposed to be doing is what we should be asking. What is it that we ought to be asking the United Nations and its various agencies is what we need to be asking. And I can tell you from my experience, and I'm sure also of my other colleagues, unless we get our act together back here, we will never be able to get out the UN what other countries are. The developed countries, I don't think we should really grudge, because their capitals sit down, they see what they need from these organizations. Look at China. China joined so late, but they have understood how to make best use of the various programs. So at any hand, just as the reform goes, I think I cannot help it. I was leaving the Geneva as Deputy Permanent Representative somewhere around 1995. And just then the UN was in this full-ranging big reform that had fever, which had gripped. And I was away for many years. Statistics I just came across as I was preparing for my talk today, and I found during this period, there were 5 working groups at any time of the General Assembly looking at the reform. Its president was engrossed in developing his own reform package. The Security Council undertook a review of its working methods. ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, after long procedural and policy debates, was then looking at procedures for NGOs, and the new Secretary General offered a comprehensive but a modest plan for secretariat reform. And no sooner had the dust settled on this reform, there was an initiative by the United States to review the criteria or the methodology of assessed contributions. So after a 5-year stint between when I left from Geneva, I was in China for 5 years, I returned as ambassador to UNESCO in 2000, and I found myself landing right at the onset of another feverish reform plan, because the Japanese Director General had been elected to reform the organization. So one question before we see what the malaise or what the downside, and I'm not for a moment, just to clarify to the chair, I'm not for a moment, a reform is needed. Any organization, any enterprise, any entity needs, it's healthy. I think you have to have continuous monitoring and reforming and so on. But how it has just become, we've allowed it to become really enduring kind of a pastime. What does it strike to you people? Why have we been talking of reform ever since, as we've just been told, the setting up of the organization? Is it a vote of no confidence? Is it what President Trump, just as he was elected on the Boxing Day, tweeted that this has a lot of potential, but at last, alas, it has just become a talk shop where people talk a lot, have a good time, well, too bad. And immediately the UN counter-tweeted, I think, listing out all the various areas that we've just talked of, and many more of the good work, disaster management, etc., along with education and HIV and literacy and so on. So what do you people feel? Is it a reflection on the ineffectiveness, the failure of the United Nations? No? Okay, think about it till the end of the talk, I think, so we'll see. Anyhow, with this mixed picture, some of the reform, I would say, very much needed, because really the UN has become a huge animal, I think, and there is, over a period of time, some of the original agencies, there have been overlapping institutions created, duplicate mandates created. UNESCO was for education, then UNICEF came along. UNICEF came along, then the World Bank took it over. So as a result, it goes backwards. Then the UN says, why does UNESCO need the money when these two agencies are performing much better? What has happened as a result of all this? And UNESCO and other social agencies, mind you, these were the organizations for the voice of the developing countries. These were the countries these were the forums and platforms, because this was an intellectual organization. The whole constitution starts, since wars start in the minds of men, the defenses of peace must also be built in the minds of men through literacy, through culture, through science, and so on. So that is how it was conceived. UNESCO Executive Board was considered such an exalted body where, Dr. Radhakrishnan was representing India and other dignitaries, and today you had Neelam Sabharwal representing India on it, because now they have reduced it slowly from this body of reflection to just a technical, supervisory, governing body where you're counting the pennies. So what has happened over a period of time? Peace, security, conflict prevention, these are the issues, human rights, which are very important, and all these, because social and economic development is not. It's a good thing that the MDGs have run their course and we have excellent sustainable development goals now, and good luck, and that should be one of the priorities that India should be pushing for. But over these 60, 70 years, the mandates, the original mandates of some of the specialized agencies, regardless of course, some malfunctioning and coordinating difficulties, have been reduced to very narrow, very ephemeral, and very technical kind of definitions. So this is a problem. In other words, there is a challenge to multilateralism. So reform, please remember, reform is needed of the Security Council foremost, of the UNGA, of the other body, ECOSOC, and the specialized agencies, but not at the cost of diluting, downsizing, and devaluing the work of the specialized agencies and its principal bodies. Second, how is that done? The budget is reduced. So more and more that the regular budgets are cut away. These agencies are not assured of regular budgets. It's extra budgetary funds. Extra budgetary funds, you know the difference? If you don't have assured regular budget, how can you promise programs? You can't promise, you can't deliver, you're an ineffective agency. Extra budgetary sources by the donors, major donors, are usually the Group 1 countries. They give those funds for programs of their priorities. So increasingly the UN, some of the agencies are becoming like donor-driven agencies, which is not the original principle, and that has to be checked. So both in terms of the budget, and second in terms of simply the strength of multilateralism, which is getting eroded, are the two downsides of because in the name of reform, and third, I'll quickly mention because the others are more competent, like in the field of human rights, because they've been wanting to just sharpen the teeth of the human rights watchdog bodies. I dealt with human rights as in the Human Rights Commission, but Ambassador Sinha dealt with it in the councils, and he would know better how the councils work, except to know that it used to work as effectively then when it was a Human Rights Commission, except under the new mechanisms, there is more and more international jurisdiction being created. So whilst you need reform, don't always think there are these champions of democracy and human rights, and there are just this other spectrum, the rogues, the non-observers, and who are, not observing the wrong. There are a whole lot of countries like ours. Tomorrow, and we talked about responsibility to protect because they slipped in this human rights violation too. What if there is somebody who wants to just tweak you politically, comes out with a resolution on Kashmir on your responsibility? It's just a wild thought and not even ever to be visualized. But these are the kind of risks. So this ever expanding international jurisdiction is again something, you know, we may think it's also glamorous talking about reform. That is again something that we have to see, and this downsizing which has to be arrested. But what the realities are, it will continue. I have a couple of suggestions on what the way forward should be, but if the time is running out, I can speak. I can? All right. Maybe those at Security Council and GA we have talked about, and please please note, in fact, there are wild proposals that even the ECOSOC should be abolished, which is the principal body to be looking at sustainable development. Of course, peace and security architecture, I think we could all agree, it could only be strengthened if international terrorism is included as a threat and as a violation of not only human rights, but as a threat to peace and security, the sustainable development goals, and maintaining the distinct mandate of the UN agency, ensuring the adequate regular funding, as I just said, to bring better program implementation and stability in the program. The norm setting, you know, the UN agencies, the UN, apart from all these programs and all norm setting and standard settings, these conventions and treaties which set kind of international benchmarks, I think, of standards, whether it's the law of the sea, whether it is something on heritage protection, whether it's chemical weapons, these have to be, and this is why it has a very special role. It cannot be replaced by Professor Mohan. I think that a body like G20 or others will not really be able to, I think, to fill this kind of a gap, I think, that the UN is able to do. So these are norm setting. Again, it is, each agency is grappling with it. We could even consider developing for soft law. We could see by custom and practice how it works, like it was pointed out on responsibility to protect. And now there is immediately criticism, there should be responsibility while protecting. And the new SG, you know, like I was told, 7 out of 8 SGs have their own reform package. He's come up with rights up front, I think. I'm even still trying to understand what that is. Rights up front, but that too is coming under some criticism. So these are the kind of things which go on, but UN is, in conclusion, doing good work. There have been achievements in the past. There is a mixed picture. There are challenges that it faces, and we should not be making these artificial distinctions between the UN body and the member states. You are all in that. You're dealing with it, but you're also dealing in the context of the world realities, but you have to be also very clear-eyed about what these major moves are and not then to be just obsessing about reform really in itself, except where it is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Veselin, and if I can pull rank on you because we belong to the same organization, and request you to speak only for 5 minutes.
No, even less than that. I want to thank Mohan for bringing such excellent, knowledgeable people who has said everything. So I really don't need even 5 before passing the mic to Rohini. But two or three observations which I think are important. One which we hear now from the current Secretary General, actually before even he took the post, is that we need to look at the reform not so much as an event or even not as much as a process, rather than as an attitude. So in a sense, interesting suggestion that it's not the correct terminology even. It's not reforming, not changing the form, rather than changing the substance. So everything we do in the United Nations, we should do it in an innovative way. So thinking of reform as an attitude really helps to get out of a lot of the deadlocks which the previous speakers were talking about. So we didn't go too far, as you all mentioned. In fact, in my own story, exactly 30 years ago, I was a junior diplomat in the Bulgarian Foreign Ministry in the United Nations Department, and guess what was on my desk? General Assembly revitalization, they used to call it. And a lot of those issues which were on my desk at the time are still in the agenda. How to shorten the session, how to make clusters, how to have items in the agenda, not every year, but biannualization or triannualization of the agenda items, how to raise the role of the President of the General Assembly, and all of that. So there is not much movement apart from repetition of the same issues, exactly because we think of reform as changing structures rather than changing attitudes. But we have some successes indeed. In 2005, in the Anniversary General Assembly, the report of the high-level panel and later Kofi Annan report in Larger Freedom really made possible the establishment of the Peace-Building Commission, for example, or the establishment of the Human Rights Council instead of the Human Rights Commission, were examples when the political will was there, the intellectual capacity was there, the champions of the reform were there, the several countries, including the Secretary General, and that made it possible. Certainly with the Security Council, apart from in 1963 when the Council was expanded with 4 new non-permanent members, there has not been much. But the lesson of those days back in the 1960s is that the General Assembly should get unified if it wants to get a resolution with 2/3 majority passed. What happened with the report in 2005 in Larger Freedom, the suggestion of Model A and Model B effectively divided the world. There was 2 options, one with new permanent members, 6 G4 plus 2 Africans, and another model which was championed by Italy for semi-permanent members, but it exactly divided 50-50 the world. General Assembly is not unified behind one of the 2 models. In fact, Italy interestingly argued that in an anecdote, the ambassador in New York, after many, many times, everybody was talking about Germany and Japan as new members, or new permanent members of the Security Council. In one, they said, why only Germany and Japan? Italy also lost the Second World War. We should be the permanent member as well. It was Paolo Fulci in New York back in 1995. So the lack of unity of the General Assembly is a major problem here, and probably that's why there should be a breakthrough model, not the usual ambition to get new permanent members, or, on the other hand, to have a very rigid model, which also, Model B is not less rigid than Model A. Now, something else, and it is the last thing which I want to say. Another, I'll call it insufficiency or failure to reform is the selection itself of the Secretary General. There were a lot of talks to have a Secretary General in a single longer term, not twice 5 years, where first 5 years are basically very timid and shy. They simply expect to be re-elected. And for that matter, they are very much slaves of the Security Council. And only after being re-elected, in the second 5 years, they get a little bit more independent. And Kofi Annan actually used his second term in 2003-2007 to make the reform possible. And the suggestion of selecting a Secretary General for a single longer term should have extra support, and it was already adopted, by the way, in General Assembly resolution back in 2005. It's nothing new. People were writing about this back in 1991. Ramesh Thakur wrote on this very long time ago. And the second change there should be that the Security Council should give more than one candidate to the General Assembly for Secretary General to be elected. Again, a position shared by many. In fact, I argued it strongly 3 years ago when the last selection was made, when there were already a lot of female candidates, a lot of candidates from many countries. Everything else happened, but without having the more than one candidate given to the General Assembly to make the real election of Secretary General, everything else somehow doesn't work, exactly because the P5 continue to to be the only decision makers of who the next Secretary General will be. When I, in fact, confronted the British permanent representative and asking why Britain is not more reformist, why they don't allow a vote in the General Assembly between two candidates, one female, one male from two different regions, which will be a brilliant way to select Secretary General. He said, but that's not a good idea because what will happen is that the vote will go divided. 55% of the country will vote for one, 45% for another. How can a Secretary General work with 55% of the support of the Assembly? To what my response was, at the moment, they have only 5% of the support of the General Assembly. It's only you guys who are doing the selection, nobody else. And you give one single person to the General Assembly basically to rubber stamp and to cheer, which is very much the case of electing North Korean president. So do you want General Assembly to do exactly what dictatorship do when they elect their Secretary General through 99.9% of the vote of the Assembly? So it's not a good argument. The argument against the single longer term was that, but what if we have a very good one? Why should we only limit to 7-year single term? Again, not a strong argument. 7 years later, we'll find even a better one than the one now. So again, there is a little hope when we have a very rigid positions. So the way to do this is somehow to reformulate the issues, to think outside the box, to have extra suggestions. More voice of the South, more voice of the small countries needs to be taken as. And finally, I will say the membership of the Security Council should not be seen as a privilege of the past. It should be seen as a burden sharing for the future. It's not that I want to be a member because I've done a lot in the past. It's not a club where you go to drink whiskey and smoke cigars for privileged people. It should be the burden sharing, and that burden sharing and more contribution in the future peacekeeping, in the future mediation and peaceful settlement will make the current 5 more eager to share that burden for the future of the peace and security.
Thank you, Veselin. Now for some Roshni from Rohini.
I will keep this short. Brevity is the order of the day. And in the last panel, being a last speaker is very daunting. Thank you so much for the very, very rich insights from all of you. I'm not a practitioner, so I'm going to come at it from a very, very different perspective. In a panel that is rife with very rich real accounts of what happens in the UN, coming in as a theorist is a bit challenging, but I'll try to tie together and flag what I think are a few important considerations, looking at it, maybe take a step back and look at it. So, given the nature of the United Nations, international lawyers are very often called on to defend a discipline that finds no place in real politics. So the first thing that I would like to flag as a point of intervention is perhaps the role of international law here is not so much the repeated question that we ask of implementation, but it has more to do with rhetoric and reception, which does play a relevant role in understanding what countries make of this. What do I mean by rhetoric and reception? As Ambassador Sinha was talking about the history of the UN, it occurred to me that one can place the discussion on reformation along 3 axes. The first one being context. As we all know, we are talking about a moment, or the colonial moment. Despite the formation of the organization in 1945, one has to be mindful of what led to its creation and what was left out of the ambit of its creation. So the conversation on there being absence of unity has to be put on an axis of who formed the organization and what was its original purpose. The UN has since overseen, and I talk of the UN as an apparatus, has since overseen many changes, including the decolonization process, the evolution of different goals, different priorities, and an enhancement of diversity. But I think the context of setting up the organization is important to understand how it functions and why we may perceive something as not being adequately functional. The second point, again as an international lawyer, I think is of reception. Now, as Professor Murthy spoke of India's response, or for instance, juxtapose that with how China tends to navigate international law, I think an important point of consideration is how do we look at reception of international law in the post-colony. In India in particular, I think legal post-colony happened much after political post-colony. So invariably, along a spectrum, the countries respond to international law either as an European inheritance or as a challenge to it, which is the second point of consideration as far as accepting the law is concerned. The third is something I gleaned from Ambassador Sabarwa's presentation. The multitude and diversity seems to be indicative of where we place the negative euphemism as well. To put it simply, who is not a part of the framework at the moment, and is it necessary to diversify the actors that are recognized within the fray of the UN? So the theoretical framework I propose is context, reception as between the countries, and actors. And where does this play out as far as the law is concerned? Reform is a complex process, and using these axes, we need to understand what is the possibility or scope of reform. As Veselin so effectively put, it's a question of reorienting the way we perceive it. And one has to be mindful of who is reorienting to what. So what does the UN apparatus mean to different countries? It means different things. You want to invigorate the apparatus because you want to continue status quo if you're a hegemon. You want to invigorate the apparatus if you want to gain legitimacy out of an organ that clearly has the capacity to house multiple views. Look at the sheer increase in its membership. So for mid-level states, by mid-level I largely mean of moderate economic and social capital in the UN then becomes an important vehicle to garner a sense of majority. So your intention to invigorate the apparatus could clearly simply be continuation of status quo, enhancement of diverse perspectives, or even a reversal of standard. Which brings me to the second question, which is how does one inherit international law through an apparatus like UN? By inheritance of law, I largely mean a transition of power. When we are talking reforms, when we are talking context, it's also important to understand where the geopolitical power is moving, and will that have an impact on the institutions, and how? Will you adhere to an existing structure, or will you look to depart from it? In the backdrop of what is currently understood as fragmentation of international law. What is fragmentation? It's simply taking stock that multilateralism, going back to the question of context, was perhaps never a possible goal if we were to acknowledge decolonization and addition of subsequent states. So where do we stand with these three axes, with this possible apparatus, and international law gearing towards what we understand to be fragmented application of it? The way I see it, perhaps implementing international law in the regional context and acknowledging these inherent pillars and posts, including that of fragmentation, is maybe the only way to make coherent reform. Reform here being a transition to bodies and agencies that may no longer operate in a centralized fashion. And there has been, you spoke of the specialized agencies, there has typically been a response to UN specialized agencies in terms of other agencies coming up on account of representation of places that may not have found place in the original formulation. The Asian Development Bank, for instance, in response to the IMF. So I'd like to conclude by flagging a significant question. As IR students, the law may not necessarily be a point of implementation, but the law may actually be a point of reception and how states respond to that general tendency to reception. Thank you.
So I shall quickly move to 1 minute for Mr. Hasegawa, followed by 1 minute for Dr. Sharai. And then if I can request you to keep your questions short, we will group questions into different subjects. One, very quickly, reform of the UN, and then anything else. Because, I know you may have something else. So we will bunch questions and then request the panel to. Maybe I should pick one member of the panel to respond. If you can give me that prerogative as chair. I just bargained with you instead of summing up, right? So yes.
Thank you. Ambassador Kumar. here I plea to you because you are so eloquent, and I think Ambassador Sabwar's mentioning not just reform but restructuring of UN, and I will just concentrate on security issues. I think Professor Murphy's point is well taken. I think you may not have been here this morning, but what I proposed or explained and what I propose is now India take a lead. Japan and Germany, I appreciate Dr. Popovsky's comment, but has a historical baggage. And India, seen from outside, the only country, yes, apart from Brazil, has a legitimate claim for the major role to play. And be confident. And as I mentioned in the morning, be the change agent. Gandhi changed the structure. Why not? The Japanese samurais, ordinary samurais, changed it. And I don't see why India cannot. India has a legitimacy. How to go about? I think 21 countries would be enough, Security Council. I reported to Security Council 5 times. And I didn't need advice of Lesotho on the peacekeeping operations in Asia. We need countries. Now, let's legitimize G20. Add 21. 7 countries should have 20 years. Current P5 can continue. You add 2 more by elections, and another 7 countries, 10 years, and another 7 countries, 5 years. Now, how to go about? I think if India says you want a change in the UN structure, don't ask for you are adding to the current permanent members, because then you are seen to be just using your own interest. You see the age changing. And do you know how you can accomplish it? Offer Nobel Peace Prize to President Trump.
Right. Regarding the UN reform being frustrated is partly a conscious effort by the Permanent Five to talk about UN reform, but not charter reform. And there hasn't, in most countries, if you want to change the government, what do? You go to elections. And in the UN, the charter exactly says what to do if you want to reform the UN. You have a review conference. But why are Permanent Five so afraid of the review conference? And this is the subject of a simulation of a review conference that organization in Sweden, Global Challenges Foundation, we are talking to them, they're funding us to do a simulation with the students, with the young people, like the model UN, a model charter review. Now, in a charter review simulation, you will have a Security Council section, just like in San Francisco. You will have a General Assembly, the relationship between General Assembly and the Security Council, the composition of Security Council, the voting, the veto, and then you would have ECOSOC, a council on ECOSOC, on ICJ. So everything is on the table. And the dynamics of such a review conference to turn into a constitutional convention is huge, and the potentials are huge. So the comment or advice was to stick to charter review rather than UN reform.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharai. I see that our chief guest has arrived, Ambassador Ghare Khan. So, sir, if I can just request 5 minutes of your time, I'm just going to finish off the questions and answer session, and I will. Thank you very much. So, very quickly, if I can have questions from the floor, we don't want to leave the panel without there being subject to some kind of inquisition on your part. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
We had today, we discussed a lot about the values that have to be incorporated when we're discussing about the multilateralism in the current context of the future of the United Nations. And so I was just wondering that if we're looking at the reform from a value system perspective, because here we can sit and discuss a lot of arithmetic and logical formulas about how to reform the system as a whole, but from a value judgment perspective, the reform needs to be initiated from states, heads of states, politicians, and everyone who is held accountable if they're by virtue a member of the United Nations. Because unless and until that accountability is coming from the states that are members to the UN, I don't see how otherwise would we look at the logical implementation of reforms that we're discussing here. And it is my understanding that if this value judgment has been taken into consideration, then even as followers of IR, maybe we will look at the realm of international law from an implementation perspective and not a reception perspective, because if that value judgment is being put in, there will be some security that we have in the system as a whole.
Does the panel believe that Resolution 377A, which is being invoked to overturn a veto, is the way to go ahead with dealing with vetoes in the Security Council? And my second small question is, how do you deal with groups such as the Coffee Group? I think now they're called the Uniting for Consensus. So how do you deal with people who are arguing against reforming or adding more permanent members to the UNSC?
Well, all I can say is that reform by definition presumes certain improvement, whereas restructuring does not necessarily can just mean change of in whatever form, but presumably restructuring would also involve reform. Now, this whole question of what can replace and what reform should take place will require perhaps not just one seminar, it will require several days of this. Consensus building today in the world is extremely difficult, if not impossible. There are 193 members, and it's very difficult to reach consensus on what to do. So even here in the panel, you will have differences, and it will take a long time to do that. What we are pointing out here was the various aspects of reform and restructuring that is currently being debated, and leave that to you, I suppose, to then discuss in the course of your discussions in your classrooms.
On to this value question. I think the world is transitioning from multilateralism to multi-stakeholderism by virtue of the pressures of pangs of Westphalian system and post-Westphalian states. I think the UN ideals as embedded in the charter preamble, prosperity and freedom, like peace, development, and human rights. Now, Kofi Annan says. I think these values are enduring values. Even multi-stakeholderism, multilateralism, either intergovernmentalism or beyond intergovernmentalism, these can be accommodated and accomplished, provided we stick to the letter and spirit of this charter-laid value system, which means inclusiveness, not exclusiveness. That's my answer to this. Something about UFC. Yeah, it's not that they don't oppose, they don't want enlargement. They don't want one. Spain doesn't want Germany, Argentina doesn't want Brazil, Pakistan doesn't want. They have geopolitical problems with the particular country's prospect of getting included. Per se, they are not against Security Council. They also want democratization, but democratization
through election, not as a claim. So let us be fair to UFC also. I think if true democratization, which means the mechanism of election, if that is the basis for opening the window for restructuring or expansion of the Security Council, I think there can emerge a meeting ground between G4 and UFC at a point of time. So I don't consider UFC as enemy of the Security Council reform, but they oppose any permanent member permanently seated there. I understand that. There are so many specific plans that are floating around, especially think tanks that are doing. Recently, elders did it, Razali formula onwards, scores of reform specific ideas are there. I think time constraint, will compel me not to go into that. But I feel one single sentence, I think Indian intelligentsia has not come up with a set of concrete ideas. Particular individuals were there in some panels, high-level panel, Nambiar, etc., etc. But what I am a little intrigued is the fact that Indian intelligence has exercised itself with some practical, acceptable set of ideas, proposals on future of the UN.
Murthy, sir, you very specifically mentioned in your address as India back then being shy and, sort of being afraid of, responsibility, etc., etc. My only question to you, sir, is that could you possibly imagine a situation or a scenario wherein a nation that's been dictated on how to govern themselves for 200 years are told yet again to come, sign a pact, share responsibility, and yet again be bounded in terms of their foreign policy to further express the future of their nation? So, I mean, my question is just, would you make that consideration when you talk about such things?
I did acknowledge the fact that given constraint, I'm not saying that Vijayalakshmi Pandit was shy. She was very courageous, very bold, very articulate. So she was doing the job basically of the promotion of the cause of India's independence outside. She did pay less attention on the design of the United Nations. Had she paid, then the official delegation would have been, helped with some ideas, counter ideas. I don't know whether it would have happened or not. But there is this given constraint on official delegation because before San Francisco, there was a London conference of Commonwealth, delegations. So British gave them brief, look, you will say this, you won't say that, and so on and so forth. So Indians stuck to their brief. But Article 19, Article 23 were some of the most important initiatives that defined the Security Council composition even now, and also defined the financial, procedures and decision making. Article 19.
Yeah, but sir, isn't that a very metaphysical, like isn't that, hypothetical situation? Because had there been that situation, the first man to walk on moon would be Narendra Iyer. I mean, yeah, like maybe.
Thank the panel for absolutely a wonderful, captivating session. Thank you.